critical creative reflection for my short film, Picking Apart. So within my short film, I decided to choose the psychological realism genre, which in recent years is not as much taken up, but it is gaining some recognition with movies such as The Joker, winning Best Leading Actor and other Oscars in 2020, and more recently, The Invisible Man by Blumhouse Studios. That both of those films are within the psychological realism genre. It can also be explained that this gain in traction can also be due to an increasing awareness in mental health and all that. So, what exactly is psychological realism? Well, psychological realism centers a lot around the psyche of the main character, meaning that what are their solutions, what are their problems, what is happening with them. So that is exactly. Am I sharing? So that is exactly what is happening around with them. And so that conflict within the seven and many types of conflict that exist within the many different other genres will fall into the conflict of man against self, which exactly is what different, like, the problem centers around the main protagonist and what are the solutions are, which can be seen in Picking Apart with the main character Mariposa that is being acted by me, having different problems with food, and that's what the whole film is about, and how it's been centering around. That's what the problem, the main solution, the hero's journey, to say it at least, is knowing what to do with that problem with food. So that comes to the first question of the CCR of how does your product use or challenges conventions? How does it represent social groups or issues? So within my genre, as I explained, psychological realism tends to not visually make the problem seem more glamorized or make it seem as more than what it actually is. For example, in films that I described earlier, The Invisible Man, the film uses a low lighting and very natural way of showing without major visual effects or major changes that may seem erratic or that you may not see with the naked eye. For example, most of it is shown through the actors' representations. And also there's a clear lack of soundtrack. Sometimes, for example, in The Joker, the bathroom scene where there's no music and it's just dancing in a dark lit bathroom where it shows directly what is happening to the audience without much glamorization of it. For example, in my film, I tried to do that by keeping the lighting pretty natural, not using many different ideas and following those conventions of different camera movements that are allowed. And for example, the POV shot, a POV shot where we see what our character is seeing and how it seizes, how it seizes, how it is from their point of view, which is another major part within the psychological realism, and how it is presenting themselves, and also during the mirror, looking at herself through the mirror. It's a way of showing what exactly is that we're seeing and what is the problem. I tend to challenge conventions within my genre by using not only the different shots throughout the film being from the point of view, but including what other characters may be seeing, like, for example, walking down the corridor, or from the outside, what a person from the outside may be seeing, something that may be normal. and also not exactly having. During the shooting, I did use natural lighting, but when editing, I changed some of the levels using my editing software to have a more opaque and grainy texture to the final product, to also make it appealing and making much more demonstrating how the character may be feeling and how they may feel throughout their space. And the sounds that I use is, again, no major sounds, but I do tend to use a very faint sound, very faint disruption in the end to kind of represent their minds' conversations within themselves and how it clouds someone's perspective many times. The issues that is mainly within my film, that it's actually what the film is about. So the whole film is about a social group or a social issue in general, which is people suffering from eating disorders and having a difficulty with eating, most of it. One example of this film being represented, of the different issues that are represented throughout the film, is films such as To the Bone, which is the journey of Cassie going to her eating disorder recovery. And the thing with how mainly society or different types of other media outlets represent the problem is about having a very stereotypical person, very stereotypical type of person represent a majority group. For example, this is seen much with movies about this conflict, about being mostly casting the main protagonist as a white female who is very much malnourished and in a state of deprivation. And most of it at the end of the film, there's a major miracle solution to the problem, and it all comes back to normal when it comes to how the issue is at least addressed. Another problem with health representation themes is that in the media, the only two major problems that have been represented throughout is anorexia and bulimia, with other types of eating disorders not being added really, or with not existent representation in any other types of film. For example, the one type of eating disorder that I took in representing trauma film is ARFID, or Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. And while researching for examples and other films that touches on similar provinces, so that I could base or have some of the conventions within my film, I found it to be non-existent and only found in documentaries or non-fictional retellings, which were helpful for knowing the position of the different persons suffering from this, and also found in resources like the National Eating Disorder Awareness Organization that has some information about this disease as well. And that is the only information that I could find for. So I cannot stick to many conventions or do any of how the typical representation for this disorder in specific were, and the only ones that I could be basing on will be unavoidably being incorrect. So I will say that I represented this film and this in a sort of through acquisition, through research, not much basing myself from the other representation that I have seen. Well, using me as an actor does catch some of the original stereotypes of how this societal and other media projects represent eating disorders. Being a young person, being of the female sex, being technically in the thinner side of things, but I will like to say that I am not exactly what I have seen in other representations for eating disorders in media that I have researched, like To the Bone or older films, because there's a significant difference between how those people and actors look for the role versus how I look within my short film, as well of me being a person of color, which there's a great lack of representation within the films about eating disorders as well. So it is an intersectional representation between a person with ARFID and a person of color suffering through this. And also, I think I represented this well through the conversations that she had with her father, Mariposa had with her father, about asking how, when will she stop being like this? Because in many of families that have seen in films about these types of things, they seem very forgiving, very understanding, and very open to what professionals might have to say. Whereas people within more cultural diverse of minorities tend to not have much openness about mental health or problems like this, or simply categorizing as being picky. That's why also the title of my film is Picking Apart, because Mariposa is picking herself apart, picking herself about how society might see her, of how her family might see her, and trying to solve this as fast as she can, which is not possible because a real recovery takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and that's why the conclusion to my short film has her only have a spoonful of peanut butter and having that as a win. Because as many other films that I have seen, the conclusion seems to be very sudden and very going through it and recovering through it. But that is just a glamorous version of how real recovery is, because real sufferers and real patients will declare how it is difficult and takes years of actual work for have real. It's a battle. It's not as short or as it has been seen in other since the beginning of how these eating disorders might be represented. From the very first film that has an explicit representation of this, The Best Little Girl in the World, which it's about someone suffering from both anorexia and bulimia. And the end comes through with more being like a sudden trying to give parents or students something that might have happened and then resolve it magically when one breakthrough event happens, when in reality the road to having or recovering takes thousands of small breakthrough moments, like I showed in my film of her actually picking up the food and not being able to finish something like this because it's just a shock to her, just a shock of having to face the textures and all that she fears. But at the end, she's able to eat what her therapist told her at the beginning of the film. And that is how I try to represent the different social groups that I took through. With the main idea was portraying someone with ARFID as accurately as possible, and I would like to say that I was able to do it through my knowledge that I acquired through informing myself, and I use majorly the conventions of my genre, but I try to convert it and try to manage it through to fit into my problem that I never seen in other films being represented. What I mean is that, for example, I would have chosen a different person to be part of this to be part of this film and also to be acting as Mariposa because due to the COVID-19 restrictions of the pandemic and how many restrictions have been, I have contacted my own friend to be performing as Mariposa, but due to personal circumstances and the pandemic, she was not able. So I had to choose within me performing or changing to a complete different story, which will not include me. And that's not what I decided. So many of my production skills were developed by exactly knowing how to position myself and put myself into the picture and knowing how I could be able to perform and do this without suffering from the story setting and the storytelling. And that was exactly how I got many of the shots. Many of the shots that I had were I guided myself a lot through this educational videos of knowing how the different types of shots were and how to do the camera movements, which I had to practice many times without it being shaky, and knowing exactly how to organize myself through also my storytelling and my storyboards that I did. And many of those were detailed through my blog, which my blog has all of the details that I had throughout this film and how my production skill developed over time. And many of the videos that I seen that were incredibly grateful to my production skills overall and knowing how to organize my space and organize the types of frames that I will be doing. I did a shooting schedule for my film. I learned how to video edit and I learned how to use the camera that I had installed within my phone since I had not been able and I'm not in the financial position to get a new camera or new recording device for this specific film. But the camera that I had and the video editing, the free video editing that I was able to get were very useful to the whole process, and also including the audio remixer that I had not considered to be an important part of the recording at all. But it is very important to know how the different recordings and the mise-en-scenes, how it interacts with the mise-en-scenes, the sound cues, and how the sound may not be as clear if you have the AC on or if you have someone else talking very loud in the background, and how to cancel that out. So I had the majority of my production skills change and develop throughout the course of the film. And the last questions within the CCR of how did you integrate technology, software, hardware, and online in this project? The main online part that I had within this project was my blog, as I explained, where I detail the whole process that I had to progressing through this 2-minute opening that I started about in January. So it took about 3 months of hard work in the details of how I included different the process, and I would not have been able to complete this as clearly and as organized as I have been if I had not been creating and publishing how my progress was going through to my blog, because I will have not integrated this part if it had not been obligated of me, but it was very much useful at the end, and it included many things that I look back to when I was recording, when I was editing, and even now where I went back and see how my notes were going and how my mindset was at different stages of the recording. Now, for the software part of my video editing and what was included within it, I had the HitFilm Spreads video editing software that I have my own opinions to, and it's not as clear and it's not as easy for beginners, as well as it's running very slow in the computer that I own. but I was able to go through and I was able to complete my film, and it had all of the different details that I wanted. And I'm pretty sure that if I had used a more simpler video editing that was still free, it would have not gotten the same result that I got. Even though some parts may not have come out as wanted, it's mostly because of me. I'm not learning enough how to use the software, but I think I've been able to get through a product that I will wanted and that I'm proud of. Another software that I used to this project was Audacity. That it's an audio software that lets you edit edit and see the audio before you input it into the video editing at the end. And so I use this software exactly for the conversation with my dad. The conversation with my dad. And that is exactly how I used to, because my father refused to record the voice for himself. So I recorded my own voice and I did it deeper, and I changed some of the settings for it to sound more masculine and older. It may not have come out as realistic as I wanted, and may have gotten out of the experience and changed some of the mise-en-scènes within the film. But I would say that it helped me a lot into also changing and making some of the background noise less, because even though HitFilm Express is a very useful video editing software and it does have options to change the audio settings, I think it was much easier to do it in a different software, even though it may have taken more time to import and export from the two different softwares. For the hardware part, I integrated and I use my iPhone SE, the phone that I use regularly for my own personal things and my own personal recordings, since I did not have other recording device. And the camera was pretty good enough to record in different frame rates and different qualities. And I used the by default camera and by default voice recording, because it seemed the easiest and most accessible voice recording and camera recording that I had, since the other programs were at a cost. And finally, I used a selfie stick that my father borrowed me for the different aerial and for the different point of view shots, for the different outside shots where I had to record myself walking, for the different moving shots, for different following shots that I had, as well as some of the shots that I took of my own face for it to not seem so close or that I was recording it. And I hope to have gotten that effect. So I hope that this CCR and that my whole process was helpful for anyone. And I hope to be able to continue doing this in the future, since I plan to major myself in film. So I hope that all the production skills and all the software that I acquired for this project will be able to translate for future projects. So thank you for seeing me, and yes, goodbye.